Anyway, top story you've just been hearing as well. The Tory Brexiteer, quite a prominent Brexiteer, many of you will remember, of course, Steve Baker. He has claimed now that perhaps Brexit should not have been allowed to happen the way it did. I mean, we're all familiar by now with the statistics, aren't we? 48 versus 52. He is suggesting, looking back all misty-eyed with hindsight, saying perhaps there should have been a super majority, so-called, of 60% in order for it to have passed. What do you make to that? And also, if you ask someone that's shouting yes at your television set, does that mean then that for every future referendum, 60% is the threshold? You tell me. Reem, what's your thoughts on it all?
Yeah, so I suspect that Steve Baker sort of said this as a result of his opinions on the Constitution. He sort of believes, I think, in democracy and believes that ultimately individuals should be able to make those choices themselves. He is, however, very much so understood about the impacts of Brexit and the positive impacts of Brexit. Ultimately, Brexit has allowed us to open up to freer trade. We have non-tariff and no quotas with trade with the EU. And much to the OBR surprise, actually, Brexit has actually resulted in and yielded some very positive impacts. Constitutionally, I don't think that we should be saying that we need a supermajority in referendums. Ultimately, what that would mean is with the Brexit referendum, it would favour Remain. And we didn't have this kind of referendum when we entered into the Lisbon Treaty. I don't think that we need to be requiring 2/3 of the country to agree with something. I think we just need a simple majority.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that you say that it wouldn't have happened, because it wouldn't have happened with the turnout and the votes the way that they were. But I would be intrigued if people knew, right, it's 60% turnout, perhaps some of those stay-at-home voters, they might have been more compelled to turn out, and maybe that 60% may have been reached. Who knows? Hindsight is a wonderful, fascinating thing. Where are you on it, Peter?
With Steve Baker, for those who don't know him, he was one of the chief instigators for successive prime ministers, causing them problem after problem, prime ministers on his own side. Now, he's also someone who talks openly about his Christian faith, which is quite unusual, and he's shown moments of regret about how much he pushed his government and how hard and how many splits he caused with some very tough rhetoric. So he's very honest in some ways, but in other ways, you have to look why he's suggesting this now. When the Brexit cause has won the Brexit vote, it potentially locks it in for generations, makes it harder for those on the opposing side to have another referendum and win it. So I credit him for candour, but you have to look under the bonnet as to why he's suggesting this.
So your suspicion is that you think perhaps if there were to be a rejoin EU referendum, you'd think then that people would then be arguing for the threshold to be higher?
Yeah, I'm not predicting that and I'm not demanding that, but I keep saying, I think we've had two referenda about 40 years apart, so there might be another one in my lifetime, but I don't think we're talking about something that's going to happen in the next decade.
Yeah, and of course he's the Northern Ireland Minister now, so people are talking about a potential, should there ever be a referendum when it comes to, say, Irish unification, would then a supermajority need to be imposed on that if this is the thing that Steve Baker is suggesting now?
Yeah, I mean, as Northern Ireland Minister over the past year, he has overseen some of the most difficult sort of relations within Northern Ireland. He's overseen the way in which the implementation of that deal, of this Brexit deal, has occurred. In many ways, giving Northern Ireland this kind of uncertainty over the past few years has been a very, very difficult decision for the government, one that I didn't support. I do think that Steve has sort of seen that as a result of, his time as a junior minister and also overseen these kind of relationships be overseen. I do think, however, when it comes to supermajorities, effectively what that would do is it would favour the existing rule. So because we were in the European Union, requiring a supermajority favours Remain, and I think that's wrong.
Do you? We had conversations, there was a couple of by-elections, as most people remember, a few days ago, and there was lots of talk about turnout. Not only turnout, one of the seats at least was won with like 1/3 of the vote or something, and some of my viewers, and I think even one or two of my panel members since then have suggested, could there be like a threshold when it comes to, you've got these by-elections, and if really most of the people are staying at home, not even bothering to turn out, should that election therefore be null and void? So these thresholds, we're talking about them with referendums. What about by-elections or even general elections?
I'm very sceptical about that because I think any reform that makes it harder for electors to have their voices heard, would be hard to justify, and it'd be very unpopular. And I know you're not necessarily suggesting this, but look at America. I think it was a 2000 general election, and obviously American elections are more complex, where you have districts and states and so on, and then their votes are added together, not in the millions, but in smaller numbers, as part of this weird coalition of counting. But the 2000 election between Al Gore and George Bush Jr. was ultimately decided in the courts. And first past the post in Britain has many problems, but it is simple, it is easy to exercise, easy to participate, and easy to decide.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, you're one of my viewers already. You got in and suggested applying that rule over to the general election. How would you enforce that? I'm always fascinated when people say, let's apply, whether it's a turnout threshold or a minimum vote threshold or whatever. How would you apply that? So many people out there, they are politically disengaged, and I would blame the state of politics for that rather than anything to do personally with those voters. So how would you get them out? How would you incentivise them or force them, or whatever the word is, to get to that ballot box? You tell me.
Well, in Australia, they have compulsory voting.
They do indeed.
So I think it's interesting. It obviously has been implemented in other countries. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's morally right to force people to a ballot box.
And it's enforced there with a fine, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's enforced with a fine. I'm not sure what the exact amount is, but I think ultimately, I think that's immoral. I think forcing people to the ballot box is immoral. I think you're absolutely right. I actually think that people feel apathetic because of the state of politics currently. We haven't got a lot of choice. I mean, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party at the moment. The Conservatives have overseen the highest tax burden since the Second World War. So really, if you are a voter and you're going to tick blue or tick red, there isn't a huge difference.
Well, yeah, and I have to say, I hear that coming through time and time again from the viewers at home as well. I am really uncomfortable with this notion of, Michelle, you better get yourself to that ballot box, and you better, even if you tick none of the above or spoil your ballot paper, you better, or else I'll be taking some of your wages off you. I hate that principle, because I think, as I've just been saying, if you want me, because no one's entitled to be voted for. If you want me to get up, get off my chair, get out in the rain and put my cross in somebody's box or draw whatever on the paper, you've got to engage me as politicians. You've got to galvanise me. You've got to work for that vote. You've got to connect to me. You don't just come up with a massive stick and batter my bank balance and make me go out there and do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Australia, Reem was correct to call it compulsory voting, but I think what it actually is compulsory attendance. So as long as you turn up, you can still write none of the above on your ballot paper.
But do you
draw a pretty picture.
Do you agree with that?
I'm really sceptical about it, because I think I don't think it's hitting people with a big stick, but it's forcing them to do something.
Taking money off them if they don't comply. That's a stick.
Well, it's more nuanced than that, because people can turn up and write none of the above. But obviously, I'm not really that keen, full stop, on forcing people to do things unless it's to prevent a harm to someone else, and not voting doesn't involve a harm for other people. So the other thing is, it'll never happen, because none of the mainstream parties in Britain are going to write down the manifesto, we want more state control over your ordinary lives in such a transparent way as compulsory voting.
You say that. I mean, look at the way, the policies that have just been announced over the past few weeks. We're seeing a ban on smoking for the next generation. We're seeing governments continuously intervene in our lives constantly. I share your sentiment. I don't want to see the government intervening in our lives in this way, but I don't think that the government are scared to. Look at the lockdowns. Look at the way in which the government have always intervened in our lives.
If I may, I think you're being very cheeky comparing voting to smoking. I mean, there's no benefit to smoking, full stop.
Absolutely there is. There are many, many people that see incredible amounts of benefits as a result of smoking. Now, smoking is bad for your health. Well, smoking is bad for your health, but many people enjoy it. Many people enjoy smoking, and I don't think that we should shy away from that. I'm not advocating for people to smoke. What I am saying is that people should be able to choose.
Well, are you a smoker? Is it one of your small pleasures in life? I'm interested to hear from that. Lots of you, well, particularly on my Twitter, you're not having any of it. Jan says Steve Baker needs to wind his neck in